Today we're going to talk about hands and feet. The essential question is, what about angles and ratios is important to understand when drawing hands and feet? The scaffolded notes are in the bottom right. I would always suggest taking notes in case there's any quizzes on terms and techniques that we're going to be learning. The learning targets are, I understand contour line and can apply it in drawing sample hands and feet drawings in my sketchbook. I can create a hand or foot drawing utilizing experimental value with watercolor and pastel on cardboard that is proportional. And lastly, I can show experimentation to create color value in my drawing that is unified and has enough contrast to see all the objects easily. Media for this unit will be chalk pastel, oil pastel, watercolor, gouache, or a combination of 2D art media. Collage and color field are a bonus. Like other units, we'll be utilizing the strong work Venn diagram to make our artwork as strong as possible. Those are things like using the rule of thirds, elements and principles, experimenting with media and techniques, and creating a social commentary or communicated idea with the subject matter that we choose. A resource artist link is provided on the very bottom there for you so that you can become inspired by what someone else has done. We'll always be using the design process of think, make, and improve. Shortly, we will be moving from our discussion here in the think mode to creating the hands and feet drawings, where we'll be learning how to make the drawings with different materials and on different substrates or different papers. Then we'll be actually talking about how to improve those, having different critiques and giving feedback to each other, as well as improving our digital portfolios. It's always a good idea to do thumbnail sketches before you start any larger drawing that you're going to be doing. You can, of course, get those images from your camera and your phone or from Google. The examples that you see here are actually abstract, but they're just a good example of thumbnail sketches. So this is a Degas called The Tub. It was created in 1886, and you can see how important the hands and feet are to the figure that Degas was drawing. So really, part of the reason that we're studying hands and feet are because they connect to the figure and they're important to draw in order to become stronger artists. I'm wondering if you guys understand what contour drawing is. Contour drawing is basically using one line while you keep the utensil on the paper. You're essentially drawing the outline of the object to capture all the curves and angles. You have to slow down a lot when you're trying to do contour. And basically, you're also able to get some of the details within, but the idea is to try to not pick up the pencil, pen, or marker, or whatever you're using to draw as much as possible while you are drawing, so there are no sketchy lines. It's all one continuous line that you're using to draw. Here you can see again, we are trying to slow down as we draw contour lines in order to get the curves and angles of your hands and feet. You need to do at least 2 of each in your sketchbook, which means 2 hands and 2 feet. On this slide, you can actually see links to the contour hand and contour foot drawing videos that were created for you. Cross contour is a little bit different than regular contour in that you're trying to run across the surface and you're basically drawing lines like a topographical map. What I really want you to think about, though, with cross contour is rather than just drawing every line to try to show each elevation like you would on a topographical map, really you could eliminate some of those lines in order to just show veins, tendons, musculature, or even fingernails if you wanted to. Basically, as an artist, it's up to you to include what you want in your drawing. What else do you think would help draw hands or feet from what we know about drawing in general? If you said thinking of the 4-step drawing process, especially seeing and shape finding, they are crucial. It's extremely important when you compare the angles and ratios and negative shapes between different parts of the hands and feet as you draw them. As you block in your drawing, you really want to think about measuring with the pencil like we learned in drawing 1. Where you take the tip of the pencil and you're comparing one part of an object to another. So for example, you could take the length of the fingers and compare that to the palm of the hand, or how long the wrist is that you might be seeing as part of your image, and some things we learned about perspective when different objects are turned away from you the shapes are going to be different and parts of the object are going to be smaller, and you can see a little bit as the hand turns on this example. So here's what I was talking about with measuring. This person is actually taking the eraser of the pencil and measuring the tip of the cougar's head, then putting their thumb in the back of the head, and they're taking that measurement to measure how long the cougar's body is compared to the head. So as you can see, there are about 6 measurements of that. You could also take that same measurement to compare how tall the pedestal is that the cougar is on. There is another example in the middle of the page with a lampshade as well. Another thing that you need to be aware of is with any part of the human body is technically the golden section means that different parts of the body can be added together to create the next larger part. So if you look at the hand on the left, you'll see that section A and B, which are the little parts of the fingers, they're called phalanges. Those parts, A and B, are added together to get the length of the bone in section C. Then you would add B and C together to get the length of the palm that you see in section D. So this is another example of the golden section measurements, and they actually have value added to the drawing, but they're breaking it up so you can kind of see how those sections would be drawn together. Again, part of the reason that we're showing you this is so that you realize that there are measurements you can use to compare one part of the body to another. Another thing I want you to see here is that technically your fingers, or the length of your fingers, is also the same length as the tip of your palm to your wrist. So technically they're measuring from this knuckle, because that would be that part of the palm, and then down to the wrist, so you can see that it's an equal amount of distance. Another thing that I want you to see here is that technically your fingers, or the length of your fingers, is also the same length as the tip of your palm to your wrist. So technically they're measuring from this knuckle, because that would be that part of the palm, and then down to the wrist, and you can see that it's an equal amount of distance. So same thing here, we're actually comparing how your hand is about the size from your chin to about where your hairline would start if you're actually putting your hand over your face. Another measurement that you can use here is technically the width of your hand should be from your wrist to your elbow. If you extend your pinky to your thumb, you can actually get that measurement there. And it's also the same length as your foot. So if you put your foot up to your elbow to your wrist, it's actually the same dimension as well. Getting into more of the basic shapes here of the hand, you really want to think about how you are drawing the different shapes. What I want you to notice about this one is this person is starting with a cube for the palm, but then they're actually starting to create more cylindrical shapes for the fingers. Again, if you take a look at your hand in different directions, you can see possibly different shapes. So here we can actually see what looks like a rectangle. It's actually almost a trapezoid, really. And then a triangle that makes up the section between the palm and the thumb. So again, basically I'm just showing you different examples here so that you can actually see different shapes within the musculature and bone structures that are going on with the hand. We're not going to learn anatomy this time. There's just way too much going on in the hands and feet to commit that to memory. It's better that you just look at the shapes and the forms of the muscles and possible edges of bones that you might see in the hands and feet. So here it just breaks down some more basic shapes. I'm just trying to put in a bunch of different examples so that you kind of see what happens as the hand is turned in space. So if we're thinking of the way that the bones actually behave underneath the muscles and underneath the skin, you can actually see how the curvilinear part in the bone is actually creating that knuckle. And that's actually why your hands go in and out. So if you really look at your hands, what you'll see is that the knuckles come out and then there's a scoop in, and then there'll be a little bit more muscle and the other knuckle that makes it come up again. And there's an in and out curve that happens on every single finger with each digit of each finger as well. as the hand or foot is pointed at you, that means that it is foreshortened, which means that you're going to really need to look at the shapes that you're seeing of whatever is pointed at you. Here it happens to be the fingers that are coming at us in a different dimension than you would normally see flat, as if you were pointing your hand like a stop sign. So again, it's really important to look at the shapes. Look at the way the palm changes underneath those fingers because the fingers are pointed at us. The forearm also changes a little bit here. We're seeing the forearm and part of the bicep if you look past the hand and up into the back part of that drawing. Another thing that you really have to think about are the negative spaces between fingers, especially as they interact with other objects. Here, this person is just putting their knuckles on a piece of paper or on a desk, but those negative spaces between the fingers are really important, as are all of the negative spaces and angles and curves around the outer edge of the hand. You can actually see the muscle or that knuckle on the last part of the thumb here and how it goes back toward the wrist and it changes direction again as it goes back up into the forearm. And the same thing happens on the right hand side where you're seeing the angles and curves of the wrist going down into the fingers and the fingers are popping out. It's really important to get all those different angles and really draw every shape that you're seeing. So again, I talked about negative spaces a little bit, and you can see that's even more apparent when you actually are moving your hand in different directions. Another part that's really important to get is the different structures of your wrist or ankle if you're actually drawing the hands or the feet. So here what is circled is the radius of the ulna, technically. So that is the bone that's in your arm. We're going to talk more about that when we get into figure, but that little bump on your wrist is really important because the bone sticks out, but then the skin and musculature goes back in before the hand gets larger again. So it's really important to really look at all of the different aspects of your hands and how they're connecting to your arms in order to draw them correctly. So this shows you a little bit more about the light source as a hand is wrapped around an object. One of these examples on the left hand image, you can see the person is holding a glass, and as the light source hits their hand, a part of their fingers are lighter than others. The same thing is happening with other objects in these images. There's a light source and you can actually see how the value would change how the fingers look, but it's really important to have those shapes in there first before you start adding the value. So here we have another example of putting some value in the hands and feet drawings. And again, those angles and ratios that we are drawing are very important. You can see when the person is curling their toes as opposed to when the person is pushing their foot on the floor, even though they didn't draw the floor in that upper left image, you can see that they're pushing their toes onto the floor. So one thing that we want to think about is as we are trying to create these hands and feet drawings, we want to think about telling a story or having some sort of mood. So you have to think of what you're going to put in your drawing to create drama that is also school appropriate. Here's an example of a bunch of hands holding different objects. It's really important that you see how the fingers react to different objects because you're going to have to draw different shapes depending on what the hand is holding. So why do you think I'm telling you to practice both positions and value of the hands and feet? If you said it's because I want you to feel confident in whatever you're drawing, you're correct. One of the other things we're going to be doing in this unit is we're going to be doing an experimental hand value on a piece of cardboard. So after you do your contour drawings, what you're going to be doing is experimenting with a small piece of cardboard and drawing either a hand or a foot. And you're going to add watercolor and then possibly either chalk pastel or oil pastel to those so that you experiment with using multiple media in a drawing. This is a practice drawing. It's only going to take about maybe a day or two in class. It's just an experiment. It's not supposed to be the perfect finished drawing. It's just for practice. If for whatever reason you do not know how to use watercolor, there is a watercolor video that's linked in this slide that you can use. You really want to practice wet on dry, wet on wet, splattering, masking fluid, lifting, and using salt. Any of those techniques you could use within your drawing that you're going to be doing. Even though this is technically painting, watercolor is kind of bridging the gap between drawing and painting. So it's something that we're going to kind of start using now, because the next class that you would be taking from here would be painting if you wanted to continue in the 2D realm. Another thing that you could do is you could create a gesture drawing of what you're doing. Generally speaking, we don't necessarily do that with the hands and feet because we can keep our hands and feet pretty still, as opposed to when we're trying to draw a figure. Basically, gestures are done really quickly, and they're to capture the weight and movement of the object. If you want to try more of that, you could come in for enrichment to do that as well. So the next thing I'm going to do is just show you a couple of different practice value drawings that other students have done. Remember, we want you to experiment with the media so that you become more confident and you can potentially maybe use those in a larger piece. Here, what you are seeing is a person really started to like using the cardboard and ink washes and watercolor. He actually used them for his AP portfolio. And these are two of the pieces where he's combining the cardboard with watercolor and ink washes. You could also potentially cut out the top portion of the corrugated cardboard and do different things. This person happened to add wax. And again, this was an AP student that was experimenting with adding and subtracting things from cardboard. She actually had a fear of bees, and so that's what her entire portfolio was based on. It's not hands and feet, but really the idea is just to show you the experimentation of different techniques. Here is also an example of using collage underneath the work. So you could potentially create a text collage underneath what you're doing and then draw or paint over the top of it. This one happens to be a still life, but it would work with hands and feet as well. Here is actually an example of that experimental collage technique with a hand or foot. This person totally took the portrait away, and all you're seeing is the eye and all of the different text that were basically criticisms of women, technically. And then you're seeing the hand, and they're pulling their eye down and sort of, I guess, rolling their eyes at the comments that are made in the background. So again, we're trying to create meaning in what we're doing. So the whole point of experimenting and possibly using collage, or possibly having an object with your hand, or possibly having a prop, would help add meaning to what you're doing. In addition to collage, you could also use color field or overlapping to create different looks to the drawings that you're doing. These happen to be figures, but you could do this with hands and feet as well. So here are some videos that you could use if you were interested in doing a color field or a text collage. You could click on any of those links to get to the videos. They will be in the Canvas module as well and in our announcements. The one other thing I want to point out are the examples on the bottom. So the bottom left is an example of an oil pastel drawing over the top of a color field, and then the drawing on the right is a color field that then was drawn on top of with both ebony pencil and charcoal. So I'm just wondering why you think I'm continuing to make you practice in different media. What do you think? If you said knowing how to use lots of materials gives you the ability to create whatever you want and make yourself valuable to future employers and others, you're correct. So this example shows you multiple hands and feet in a drawing. It's technically called Family Table. It was created by a former Nicolet student that graduated in 2006. We do need to talk about the assignment requirements. I went over this a little bit as I talked about the different things in the unit, but here you'll see requirement number 1 is to have an object in your hand or a prop of some kind, or potentially something that is interacting with the foot. It could be a hand interacting with your foot, or you could be putting nail polish on. The second requirement is to emulate any kind of textures that you're seeing with other things that are interacting with your hands and feet. So here you can see there are textures in the sandals and in the clothing that the person is wearing that are different than the hands and feet. The one thing that's a problem with this one is it's done in black and white, and we are going to be doing color value. So it talked a little bit about value techniques in that last slide. Again, we are using things like stippling or pointillism, that's using dots to create value. Crosshatch is using lines that intersect to create value. Scumbling is using scribbled lines to create value, or the side of your utensil to create value. Smudging is rubbing to create value, and line rendering would be using parallel lines to create value. As we had talked about before, combining the different value techniques is often what makes stronger drawings. So if you think of that example that I just showed you before, you can see the textures are actually enhancing this piece because it's using crosshatch and scumbling in addition to smudging. Requirement number 3 is that you need to have a mood or a message in the work that you're doing. So these 2 examples were done actually by an AP student a few years ago. And what you'll see is that she's combining smudging and scumbling as a technique, and realistically, the meaning behind these works is it's showing her anxiety. So she's always very nervous about different things, and you can see how she's kind of cracking her knuckles and she's picking at her face and pulling on her skin. And then really what's happening is she used some watercolor to do the majority of the piece, and then she took chalk and oil pastels and scribbled around them to get that effect that you're seeing in the finished versions. These also show mood. They're very dark moods, and part of the reason that you're seeing that is it's a lot of really dark values. The best example here is the one in the upper right, because you can see that the person was using color value. It really enhanced what was going on. It almost looks like there's bruising in the hands because of the color choice that was used, but it's much stronger than those examples that are just done in black and white. So again, if we're thinking about communicating a mood, here you can see the stress that's going on as the student is studying, and it's an excellent example of a hand drawing. The hand up in the hair is a little bit harder to see where the value is going there, but the hand in the lower section or the lower right of this drawing is really excellent. You can see all of the details that are going in and out on the digits of the fingers, and then how the knuckles turn and go back toward the hand, and her hand and wrist and forearm are getting smaller as they go back by her shoulder. You can see how much larger the hand is because it's closer to us, and the shoulder and elbow are smaller because they're going away. Requirement number 4 is going to be using unified color value and mark making when you are creating your piece. So if you take a look at this example, you can see they were using scumbling, so they kind of scribbled the value that they were using. They did do it in more of a parallel direction, so it's almost line rendering. But then what I want you to notice is they're using the purple throughout the piece in the negative spaces, and they're using the yellow, green, and red in the hands that you're seeing, both the hand itself and the one that's reflected in the mirror. So one other thing I want to give you a tip about is that if you are drawing your hands and feet, technically speaking, the reflections are normally a little bit darker than whatever the object is that is not being reflected. On this particular example, the reflections are a little lighter, but hopefully what you can see also with the reflection is that you're taking almost the exact same shapes and you're repeating them just by flipping them over. Sometimes taking a piece of tracing paper will help you get the reflections. As we continue to work, you need to remember to take process photos every day, because you are again going to be needing process photos for your digital portfolio. It's also a reminder right now that we're going to be analyzing the design process outcomes that are linked in the submission module portion for the hands and feet unit. Again, you are going to analyze a resource artist, and it's highly suggested that you highlight your terminology that you're using in your reflections, so it's easy to see the different terminologies that you are aware of. You should now be able to answer the essential question from the beginning. And then we're going to be taking a look at some examples of hands and feet before we go into creating the contour drawings and the experimental techniques that we just talked about.